Hi, everyone. I guess we're beginning now. I'd like to welcome you to our panel, our mental health and community-centered practices of care. My name is Eric Kim, and I'm one of the directors at GYOPO. But before we begin, GYOPO would like to begin our time together by first acknowledging the land we occupy as settlers. I'm currently calling in from Tongva land, now known as Los Angeles. I would like to acknowledge the Keech people, and we pay our respect to them and their elders, both past and present. There will be ASL interpretation provided by Hetty and Gina during the entire program. And we will also have Kelly live captioning. And you can please click CC to receive the closed captioning. And if you have any questions, please direct any tech-related questions to the Q&A box. Thank you. So this panel in particular is of special importance to me because I work in healthcare. Our panel today will be an online or a roundtable discussion on community-centered practices of care, accessing the deep experience of our participants. And as far as my experience, I guess I just wanted to say that I think that mental health is certainly seems to be a pandemic within the pandemic, especially during COVID. And surprisingly, it's one of the major contributors to mortality in the United States that's actually gotten significantly worse in the last 30 years, as opposed to many of the other medical and public health crises that we've seen. So our panelists today represent a broad base of experiences and expertise. Mimi Khúc is a writer, scholar, and teacher of things unwell, and scholar, artist, activist, and is a scholar, artist, activist in residence at Disability Studies at Georgetown University. She's the managing editor of the Asian American Literary Review and guest editor of Open in Emergency, a special issue on Asian American mental health. She's very slowly working on several book projects, including a manifesto on contingency in Asian American studies and essays on mental health, the arts, and the university. Mostly she spends her time baking as access and care for herself and loved ones. Gonji Lee, they, them, is a queer Korean child of immigrant parents. They believe that everyone deserves to have a therapist who is able to hold people in all of their nuanced complexities. Gonji is passionate about disrupting white, cis-centric, and heteronormative notions of healing and believe that there must be concurrent individual psychotherapy, community, interdependent care systems and advocacy, systemic movement organizing change in order to set up the conditions for our communities to thrive. They have the privilege of partnering with people on their journeys to nourish and flourish, even while living under multiple systems of oppression. Hieu Nguyen, LCSW and MBA, currently serves as Orange County Healthcare Agency's first director of the Office of Population and Health Equity. Hieu previously served as the director of system of care at Mind OC, a nonprofit organization that seeks to collaboratively transform the mental health system in Orange County. Through public and private partnerships, actively engage community stakeholders to actualize the Be Well OC movement. Previously, Hieu served as Director of Clinical Services and Operations at Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, a community-based organization serving medically marginalized communities. He also serves as the Strategic Initiatives Manager for the Behavioral Health Department at LA Care Health Plan, where he oversaw population health and equity initiatives to increase access and improve healthcare for vulnerable populations. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mimi.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you to GYOPO for organizing this really important conversation. I'm excited to be here. I want to start by first inviting folks who are here to use the chat enthusiastically. And I hope we can engage there. Since this is a webinar format, we can't see or hear you all, but I hope we can engage via the chat. I'm going to start with a short piece to lay the groundwork and foundation for our conversation. I do want to say a content warning. There will be mentions of self-harm, suicide, and trauma. I work in mental health, but not clinically. I engage a humanities and arts approach. So I ask questions of structure and culture, of meaning, of normativity, meaning what we think is normal, what we think should be normal, of our ideas about wellness, and our relationships to systems of power that shape our experiences and who we become. So I think about Asian American mental health not as individual pathology to be individually treated, something we call the medical model in disability studies, but as collective and systemic and structural. We live within structures that harm us, and the toll of that is often too fucking much. I also teach about mental health. I currently teach at Georgetown, but I've also taught at other universities. I teach in disability studies and Asian American studies, and I help students critically examine their ideas about their bodies and minds and their relationships to their bodies and minds. And I think both of those fields actually work really well for doing that work. When I teach an Asian American studies course, I always start with suicide. And that is shocking to some, both students and other faculty, my colleagues. I don't think most Asian American studies courses start that way. But I learned something life-changing years ago when I first read Eliza No's essay. That's Eliza, Elizanoh. Her essay entitled A Letter to My Sister, which was published under pseudonym Lisa Park, Lisapark. I learned that Asian Americans are suffering and that suicide is sometimes the horizon of our lives. So I start there because this shit is life and death. Those are the stakes of studying Asian American life and of trying to live an Asian American life. In this essay, Eliza wrote to her sister who committed suicide to make visible her sister's pain and also the conditions surrounding that pain. She writes, I must bear witness to the crimes committed against you and against us that led to your suicide. Over the years, I've returned to this letter over and over in my teaching, in my writing, in my creating, because it so resolutely pulls back the veil that covers over our unwellness. We are not supposed to look directly at what hurts. We're supposed to find ways to move on, to forget, to erase. Eliza does not let us forget. She will not let us pretend. Indulge me for a moment. I'd like to read a few passages from this piece, since likely many here have never read it. And if you've never read it, please go read it right away, like after this webinar. So the first passage I'm going to read talks about a suicide attempt. And this is Eliza writing to her sister. The first time was different in many ways. First of all, no professional psychologists or mental health experts knew about it. Everyone in our family kept your suicide attempt secret and normalized it as if it had never happened. Secondly, I know you did not want to die, but to get our attention. I remember coming home and discovering you in bed with your wrists bandaged and the bathtub full of blood and water. You thrust your limp arms into the air and cried, pleading for my help. I was devastated, brokenhearted, sickened, and bizarrely nervous all the while about what our parents would do if they had to be interrupted at work. I looked to our brothers for direction, but they acted as if nothing was going on. There was no big emergency. I convinced myself that you were not dying. When our parents finally discovered you, they became hysterical and burst into wails of anguish. I was so taken aback by their rare show of sympathy that I began crying myself, throwing my body onto yours, because only then did I feel safe enough to reach out to you. Once our mother wondered aloud why I had not told them right away about your suicide attempt. I did not explain myself to her, but it was because all the violence in our lives, both physical and emotional, made your suicide attempt seem normal every day. It was not that I was unaware of what a crisis looked like, but that I was used to having to assimilate them into quotidian everyday experience. I was more worried about controlling the disruption than about what was actually happening to you. I knew there was an emergency. I was ready to do something, but then I felt I was supposed to walk away, like all the other times when one of us was in distress. Silence was disciplined into us. And then I'll read another short passage here where Eliza tries to synthesize some of this experience. The Asian model minority is not doing well. Do you see what a lie it is and how it is used to reinforce the American dream and punish those of us who don't succeed or succeed too much? It is making me mad knowing the truth of this culture, which is so obvious and yet so strategically dissimulated in the everyday that it becomes invisible, and nothing is left but the violence that results from its disappearance. How do you point out the horror of something that is so fundamentally banal and routine that it ceases to appear traumatic? So I actually read this piece out loud with my students on the first day of class. And that opens up all kinds of conversation. But mainly what I tell my students is that they are not crazy. We are not crazy. And Eliza's essay reminds us that there is something invisible and horrific about Asian American life, and that something has taught us to swallow the traumas of our lives to the point where they cease being recognizable as traumas, and we are left choking on a pain we can't name or even see. Sometimes we even say it's good for us. And so I'm really happy to be here to talk with two Asian American mental health practitioners about the forms of pain they are seeing on the ground in the various communities they engage, and the work of care they think is necessary to address that pain. So that sort of forms the first question that I want to ask our panelists here, Gonji and Hieu. What are you seeing? What are the issues that are coming up with the individual clients you're working with, but also the community groups and communities that you're working with? What patterns are you seeing? And this could also be pre versus post pandemic, if that's changed, if certain things are becoming more prevalent or more urgent. What are y'all seeing?
I'm just still sitting with the words and the passage that you're reading, Mimi.
Oh, thank you. I mean, isn't that letter like fucking amazing? And it was actually written a long time ago, but I feel like for me, I keep coming back to it because even as it was written, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, it feels like it could be yesterday.
Yeah.
It feels like one of my students could have written it. Right? And actually, Eliza wrote it as her senior thesis in college.
Mm.
And Eliza's a professor now, actually, in Asian American Studies and studies depression among Asian American women.
And I think the reality is that it is still relevant, if not more, right? And so, I don't know, that letter just brought up so much for me.
Well, say more than, yeah, like say what are you feeling, but also like what stood out to you, what surprised you, what feels resonant. I don't mind starting there.
Yeah, I think there's one phrase that you said, this shit is life and death. Like, I think that's sort of what's resonating with me a lot. And I know that it's resonating with a lot of people right now, right? I was just in a panel with young activists, community activists, in terms of what inspired them to do the work that they're doing in community organizing and activism around racial healing and justice. And one of the young person shared like this is life and death for them, And so they can't just stand still, and we can't stand still or stay silent, right? And so, yeah, so when you said that, it kind of just really brought me back to that conversation with a young person. And I think that's where, I also see in sort of what you read, it wasn't just about, the experience of having somebody died by suicide, right? But it was some of the trauma, the intergenerational trauma of growing up as Asian American. And that when we, the normalizing it could be anything, could be attempted suicide, could be, when you have, when you're trying to come out as a queer person in an Asian family, it's that brushing it under the rug, like pretending like nothing happens, right? And so what we do learn over time is what you shared, swallows our traumas, right? The traumas of our life, and just left feeling oftentimes like you're choking and smothering in all of the pain and all of the things that can't be, spoken.
I find my students would resonate with exactly what you're saying, in that they don't have the language, but they are feeling deep pain, but have no language for that pain, no explanation for it, especially like you're saying, because we're told that we're not supposed to be in pain, or we're not supposed to complain, or we're supposed to be grateful, right? For whatever the fuck that we're given, we're supposed to be grateful for it, and we're not allowed to complain. So then it doesn't feel like life and death, even as it is life and death. It feels like it's just normal, everyday minutia, and we should ignore what we're feeling. We're basically being gaslighted, and then we gaslight ourselves, right? I see Gonji nodding a lot, so I want to give them a chance to join in.
Well, I think it's just so powerful and meaningful, Mimi, that you opened with this, because of exactly what you said. I think when there's just such a pervasive silence around the topic of suicidality, that I think everyone thinks that like we're in our own silos, thinking no one else is having this experience, and that if I'm feeling that pain that I'm not supposed to feel, then the problem is me. Like, why don't I have the skills or the resilience or this inner resource that everyone else seems to have to not feel this excruciating pain? And then hence the gaslighting, right? Where it's like, oh, I guess it's me. There's something wrong with me and what I'm doing. So I just want to name how powerful it is to just speak words to this experience, and to even identify it as a shared experience of was probably a surprisingly number of folks. I think in itself is such an insurrection, and a fuck you to the conditions and the systems that have caused so many people to feel this way, So I'm just hella appreciating just starting off with that.
Thank you. What you said, Gonji, about realizing that you're not alone in the feelings that you're feeling. I also have seen that among my students. Like I said, I'm not a practitioner, so I mostly engage students, college students, about their mental health. And they come into my classroom often feeling very much alone, like as if they're the only one experiencing what they're experiencing. And then part of what's transformative or revelatory is discovering a whole classroom full of people who are experiencing very similar things, and building community across that, but also like feeling suddenly normal, suddenly like, oh, like my experience is not pathological, is not alien or unique. It actually is a part of something bigger. And that I think is a kind of healing already in of itself, right? And so that's sort of what I try to generate or induce in my classrooms is like this shared sense of vulnerability, shared pain, and then like starting to think critically about like, okay, what are the systems, right, that contribute to why we're feeling this way. And part of the reason I think that students think they're alone is already what we've talked about, like not having language because we're told we're not supposed to be in pain or complain about these things. But also what Gonji was alluding to is that everyone else looks like they're doing fine. So for me, that speaks to a kind of performativity, right? We're supposed to perform like we're doing fine. And for Asian Americans, that means getting really good grades and succeeding, right? Becoming doctors and engineers. And if we can do that, then of course nothing must be wrong. And so if we are seeing other people succeed in those ways and not talk about how that form of success can actually be quite stifling and soul crushing, then we feel alone. So in some ways we're like sort of doing it to each other too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I think your comments earlier about like we're not supposed to talk about it, right? We're not supposed to kind of because of language. I know in my culture, Vietnamese culture, there's no language to describe a lot of emotions, right? I basically know 3 emotions: happy, sad, and mad. You know, Mimi is smiling, but
We
I think
also have crazy, not crazy. That's it.
crazy and not crazy, right? Any other kind of nuanced emotion, we just don't have language. And when we think about the generational differences and the language barriers between parents and young people, and even myself and with my parents, there's not a lot of space to connect at a deep level, right? And to share. And so I do see that piece in working with young people, young Asian Americans as well, which is there's just a sense of kind of disconnect from family, and because one of the reason being the language barrier, right? Not being able to share, not being on top of the cultural piece already, there's a language barrier that's added to that. And on top of that language barrier, I think there's a generational gap where I think sometimes younger generations were much more willing to talk about our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, right? Where we're at. Whereas, our parents' generation may not, right? Because for many of them is the not knowing, not having the language, but also the space that they grew up in terms of trauma and just surviving and and just sitting in that space and not knowing what to do. And so I do see a lot of young people coming in, whether that it's initially because of depression, anxiety, right? Some level of trauma. There is underlying disconnect with parents, families, and communities on some level. So that's some of the stuff I'm seeing in the community, and as I work with young API folks.
Gonji, are you seeing similar kinds of, intergenerational dynamics or just issues of like silence or finding language?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that happens a lot for folks whose caregivers or family is have immigrated here. There's definitely that disconnect, language, generational, cultural. And I was just thinking, Hieu, from what you were sharing around, like, I think, on that piece of trauma, the trauma that a lot of our caregivers have experienced, there's just kind of this, like, I don't know, a culture of scarcity, a scarcity mindset around, like, don't know, like there's a limit to everything. There's a limit to how much we can give each other. There's a limit to how many emotions we can feel. There's a limit to abundance. There's a limit to feeling joy. There's a limit to prosperity. And I feel like, you know, what you were saying around we're doing this to each other. I feel like it's almost like the systems that be, you know, all the isms don't even have to work that hard because they did such a good job of us internalizing that stuff and doing this job for them. You know what I'm saying? We've internalized so many of these notions of what we deserve, what we're deserving of, what the possibilities are, what the future can hold, like limiting our imaginations, that they don't have to do shit, we just do it. So, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that our parents, our caregivers have a scarcity mentality from war and, you know, trauma and fleeing and all of this stuff, right? Where it's like, how can I give you more than what I've already given you? Like, what does that even look like? And I see us sometimes too, even like recreating that when we think of like, you know, Gen Z. I guess I'm like a millennial, I think. And I'm always like, I'm obsessed with Gen Z. Gen Z is everything. Like they give me so much life. But then I hear like some peers like, well, like we've been through so much trauma, you know, like a lot of my QTIPOC fam, where it's like we've been through so much and now they have it so easy. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's that scarcity economy, like that scarcity mindset that we just internalize around like, yeah, around what we deserve. And so I think it's really powerful when we start stepping into like what happens when the limit does not exist. You know what I'm saying? When the more that we have abundance, more that we have joy, like that feeds into one another, and we just are constantly multiplying. You know what I'm saying? I think that's always a conversation that's always really exciting to have with folks.
Gonji, that made me think of a bunch of things. I love the scarcity language that you're using to identify. I mean, like immigrant and refugee life is fucking hard, right? Things I think are actually quite scarce for many people in their experience of coming to the US. And then what does that drive families to do, right? To shape a kind of survival in the US. And then the traumas that you were naming, it made me think about like the traumas. It totally makes sense that traumas would create a certain kind of scarcity mindset that limits things. I also think the traumas get like held up too as like to comparatively, right? So like for me as second gen, my parents are, you know, Vietnamese. One was immigrant, but one's refugees. I have a lot of refugee family members. So like what is possibly legible about second gen pain compared to war and escaping Vietnam by boat, right? And having to come here and work hard from nothing. So like that level of trauma gets held up and deployed in a way that for me, I feel like my generation, second gen, meaning American born or come here very young, how do we compare, right? How do we make legible our pain if that pain is held up as like what actually counts as pain, right? And so then I think our pain that feeds into why we don't have language, because we haven't experienced something like war or, you know, refugee survival or boat journeys. Like how do I make my parents understand that going to school in this white fucked up country is fucking hard, right? How do I explain that the drive to get straight A's, to survive, to become a doctor is soul crushing when they're like, all you gotta do is go to school. I don't understand, right? I had to when I was whatever, you know, with no shoes, all of that, right, gets told. And so I feel like the way trauma is not only experienced, but talked about, because I don't think we actually have full silence on trauma. We have, I think, strategic silence on trauma in some of our families. My families will talk about boat journeys when they feel like talking about boat journeys in order to just discipline their children, right? So I feel like trauma floats around in our families in different ways, and that affects everybody's mental health.
I do think that sometimes, even when it's strategic trauma or where it's being brought up, I don't think it goes to, at least for myself, for my family, it doesn't go to the level of them understanding the impact of trauma, right? The impact of their experience of trauma in terms of their parenting, in terms of how they view the world, right? How they, yeah. So they talk about trauma as if it was something that happened to them, and it doesn't get further sort of analyzed or processed, right? I do think the other piece where we oftentimes I don't even know where I was heading with that, actually. I had something and it eclipsed me. So Gonji, please help me out. I'll come back to it.
Things leave our brains. We're also functioning on pandemic brain right now. So the fact that we're even having a coherent conversation at all is amazing to me. So I think already we've done some fantastic cohesion in our conversation. So yes, let things disappear. It's totally fine.
Oh, I remember.
Oh, it's coming back. Okay.
Yeah, it came back. So I think the other piece where I'm seeing it's not just about trauma when there's a comparative kind of nature to it, right? I think just a lot of culturally, there's a lot of comparison regardless, like between us and other families and other relatives. And then on top of that, what I'm seeing right now with you know, in the conversation around Black Lives Matter, and then more recently, the anti-Asian hate, anti-API, there's also that comparative comparison across sort of different groups, right? And yeah, I think that going back to Gonji's sort of comment about scarcity, and that's what happened when we kind of function from a deficit mentality, right? From a scarcity mentality. So I see that comparative piece like across, right? Not just between generation, but across what we're seeing in the community. So, yeah.
Something that came up as both of y'all were speaking also, like in terms of like how we relate to our traumas, both for our like generations who have immigrated here, who are refugees. I feel like there's in general an experience of almost like where our traumas and our hardships become incorporated as a part of our identity. And so although it's like here's all the ways that it's like hurt me, but here's all the ways that also makes me who I am. And I think I see this a lot with folks who I have the privilege of working with, where it's like, I want to be in a place where these traumas take up less space in my life, but also feels so invalidating to let that happen, because it's almost like that negates everything that I and my family have been through. And so I feel like there's such a complex journey on our like path towards this ongoing, you know, dynamic path of, you know, healing around, it's not so simple as like, how can I just, you know, feel better and work towards mental wellness? But it also causes us to really confront these questions of, then what does that mean about who I am and what value I have and what my story means if I change my relationship to my hardships? I'm not sure if y'all have seen that also, but that's something that came up to me.
I really appreciate you bringing up the complex nature of healing. I think maybe the popular ways of thinking about self-care or healing are very simplified, right? It's like, go take a bath or get a scented candle, and that's somehow care or somehow healing. Or to be a little bit less, you know, facetious, some of us may think healing is this kind of linear process, right? That involves either getting over something, whatever that means, or like, this is something from disability studies, possibly even restoring you back to who you were before the bad thing, right? And neither one of those are actual models for how we experience our identities, our lives in healthy ways, like pretending something didn't happen or trying to return to the past, or right, or erasing and getting over and not feeling things about that anymore, or what we're sort of told healing should look like. And so I love you bringing up like the idea of like, how do you think about your identity in relationship to trauma? And also, Hieu, you talking about first gen, talking about trauma, but not processing it, right? Not actually understanding what that trauma means. So for me, both of those descriptions are a much more nuanced way of thinking about healing. And when we can think about healing more capaciously, that it's more complex, it can be all kinds of things, it can look different than what we expect. For me, that opens up then what creates that healing, or what kind of care, right, that we need. If our healing isn't limited to this, if it's bigger, then it requires all different kinds of care that maybe we didn't think about before. So I would love if you all could talk about some of that you're seeing there too, in your own work or other people's work, about the kinds of care that seem to be addressing some of these issues that you're seeing out there.
And I feel like there's so much to learn from the disability justice movement also around this like fake idea of this fake binary of illness versus wellness. And because when we get stuck in that binary thinking, then this notion of like healing, what healing looks like, can feel so just overwhelming and like unachievable because it's fake, you know, like what is illness versus wellness, you know, like what? But I think that some ways that I've seen, to go beyond like this like individualized sense of what are you doing to feel better. I think that again, the abolition movement is somewhere to look towards, because I think the prison system and mental illness, the mental health institute are just, it's just one, they're each other. So yeah, and I think that these conversations around transformative justice is so powerful because it really forces us to think about what it means to address the root causes of even the worst harms, that we see around us, and having conversations of what does it mean to take care of one another, and that no one is expendable, and how are we as a community being accountable to everybody, and really thinking outside the box of punishment, of shame, of guilt, to try to cause change. How do we go about it with the belief that everyone can transform if only the conditions and the resources are there? And I think it's been really exciting. I've been learning a lot, at least from that movement around and what that means for what healing can look like outside of just like, in this world, because we're constantly thinking about what's wrong, but what are we going to replace things with? And if we can't recreate that in our interpersonal relationships and the way that our microcosms of our universes, if we're not doing that with our people who we love and care about, how can we imagine to then replace like these like systems of, of white supremacy and, incarceration and, all that stuff? What are we going to replace it with? So I think we're really having these conversations on, okay, what does it look like to create pause? What does it look like to hold each other accountable with love? What does it look like to confront even the messiest, ugliest parts of ourselves and each other, and still work towards that transformation?
Oh, I love that so much. I love you bringing up transformative justice as a modality of healing, both individually and community level. Right? And that has to happen together, right? The individual and the community. I love therapy. I'm in a lot of therapy. I have a lot of therapists, and that is the work that I can do for myself, right? And on myself. But like you're saying, that is not in isolation. It cannot be in isolation, because your question about what do we replace the stuff with that we're trying to undo, because we reproduce all this bullshit in our relationships, right? And so I love the idea of healing has to happen at a relational level, like individual level, relational level, community structural level, because the harms will keep happening if we don't think about those things. And I love accountability as a way of thinking about healing. Accountability is a form of love, right? And how do we do that? And I think like I really like opening up healing in those ways. I really appreciate your comments there. I also wonder what it looks like to try to create accountability with our parents. That's my that's my back of the mind question that I don't know how to do. But I like the idea of accountability in all levels, in all areas, right? So yeah, thank you for that. Hieu, did you want to jump in?
No, not sure if we want to open that can of worm in terms of accountability with our parents. Oh. No, I just go back to the conversation that we had, your comment you had earlier, Mimi, around self-care, right? And you know, for me, self-love, loving kindness, caring for self, wherever that might be, it's all to kind of self-preservation, to preserve our to have some sense of preservation of ourself, right? And you know, I think Andre Lorde said, caring for self, for myself, it's not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare, right? And I think that with everything that we have going against sort of marginalized community, as we engage in self-love, right? That really goes against what white supremacy, what the oppressor want us to feel, right? And even if it's just an act of self-care, whether that's taking a bubble bath or whatnot, right? And it might seem small, but I think even in that act itself is very powerful. And so, you know, I think for me, I've had to really learn what that self-love is. It, you know, and it's been engaging in a lot of like therapy, you know, engaging a lot of like workaholic anonymous groups, engaging a lot of like deconstruction of like ideas about what is enough, when am I enough, right? Whether that's with family or whether that's like feeling like we have to be out there at every single protest, you know, at every single community event. And so it's just deconstructing all of those notions and kind of relearning and repracticing. And sometimes not even it's like just learning how to practice and how to do those things. So for me, that kind of this caring for self, you know, practicing self-love, you know, to preserve ourselves is very important in our own mental health, how we interact and relationally with our families, our loved ones, and then the community, and then how we bring ourselves to community organizing. How do we bring ourselves to activism so that we don't re-traumatize ourselves, and then also don't re-traumatize others in the process, right? Because I'm also seeing a lot of that at play in organizing spaces and in activism spaces. So.
Thank you for bringing up the Audre Lorde quote. I love that quote. I love the idea of care for ourselves and for each other as an act of resistance or evolution, because like you're saying, the systems around us don't care for us. And so feeling entitled to care is already resistance, right? Allowing yourself to receive care is already resistance. I want to add that I think this language I've learned from the Nap Ministry on Instagram, that rest is resistance, right? And thank you for bringing up Hieu, Workaholic Anonymous, because I think that our relationship to our bodies and our minds and our communities and our identities are often wrapped around a form of ableism that pushes us to work, and value ourselves based on productivity, right? So your question of when am I enough? We're often taught that we're not enough from that scarcity model, like Gonji was mentioning. but also because we equate working or productivity or achievement with success and being enough, right? So then we push ourselves. And there is never enough. If that's the way you, right? If productivity is the way you measure your self-worth, then you have to always be working to feel like enough, right? And if you stop, then what? Are you a failure? And so I feel like resting or resisting that impulse and kind of revaluing ourselves to say that we deserve care, we are entitled to care, we are entitled to not have to work in order to be recognized as human and valuable, right? For me, that's really important work that everyone should be doing, but I also see it in particular ways showing up for Asian Americans as well. Gonji, did you want to add anything to that or respond to any of those ideas?
Yeah, I think self-care is great. I love taking a bath, you know, some smart salt, listening to some Frank Ocean, you know, like putting on some essential oils, you know, it's nice. I mean, I think that we all deserve it, you know, like y'all are saying, that stuff is so important, and our rest. And also kind of what you were saying too around like also recognizing that self-care is like those boundaries, you know, it is around recognizing our own patterns and what we need, because everyone's so different. I think it's dangerous when corporations, you know what I'm saying, are like, oh, you know, here's mindfulness in a chip bag, you know, like that's self-care, like eat that, you know what I'm saying? And then our employers or our academic institutions are telling us, well, if you go take that bath, then that should negate all of the other problems that are actually really like just what is it called? Like just interwoven into the whole, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, oh, you know, you're working 80 hours and, you know, you can't really take your vacation days or take sick days without feeling guilty, but like, you know, just go take your bath and feel good. You know what I'm saying? And so I feel like these individual acts of taking care of ourselves are so important, but it always has to be concurrent with also acknowledging like, okay, also how is me like suffering under these systems? Very normal, you know, and actually it's a good thing that my red flags are going off, because that means that my body knows and my spirit knows that this is not acceptable. And that's actually really powerful, that our bodies and spirits know that it's the case, even though it's been like I don't know, knocked into us since we're young, this, you know, very ableist notions of, you know, productivity equals self-worth.
And I think we often do self-care in order to do work, right? We do self-care so that we can go back to work, not because we just deserve it, right? And so then that's the only way we don't feel guilty about it. It has to serve that other purpose. And so this is the kind of co-optation, I think, Gonji, that you're mentioning, right? Where self-care is dangerously co-opted by corporations, but also by ableism, right? By like telling us that we only deserve care if it serves the purpose of getting us back to work. So yes, you know, you're working 80 hours a week. Okay, here's some wellness. My university gave us during the pandemic a wellness app for all faculty. And that was the care that faculty were getting, right? So that we can go back to work. So like meditate a little bit on this app and then come back to work. And I'm like, how about we just shut the fucking university down instead, right? Instead of making us all go to work in this really awful moment. But no, self-care is for the, you know, for the purpose of continuing to work. I wanted to pivot a little bit and ask you all then, from your experiences, from these ideas that we're talking about, what are the ways that you're trying to enact this work at the community level, but also what challenges are you facing as you're trying to, you know, disseminate some of this knowledge, do this processing or healing work, create better relationships of accountability, situate our lives in larger, you know, structural fucked up contexts. What is working for you? What are challenges that you're facing as you're doing all of that? I want some happy stories too. Like what's what's working? What are you feeling good about in your work? And then also, what are you feeling shitty about in your work?
I think that one thing that's working is having these conversations with like my chosen fam, you know, around my community where there already is a history of a lot of trust and there's relationship there, and really starting there. I mean, I think, you know, there's these like workshops and trainings that for like the general public, which I think is really valuable, but I've been really fed lately by having those really deep conversations with my community around, okay, all right, the system is still catching up. You know, we've done a lot of work already to address some of the underlying causes of, you know, why our communities have both suffered and thrived, you know, concurrently. But yeah, like how can we start really imagining what I was saying earlier around what a different system of care and accountability and love can look like. We have we have something called like TJ Sundays, like Transformative Justice Sundays, where it's just a small group of like 12 to 15 of us that gets together on TJ Sundays. I guess it's our church, you know, and we are just teaching each other. We're teaching each other. We're talking about, well, I guess it's connected to one of the barriers is that I think one of the barriers is that we're all so fucking traumatized. We're so freaking traumatized. And we're like in these cycles of trauma with each other. And so, you know, like we're like, yes, uprising, let's fuck shit up. And then we're like, oh shit, now we're fighting each other. We're fighting each other in this conflict. And then our nervous system gets all fried because our trauma response is going off. And then we're like, screw all of this. And then everything just stops, right? And I've seen this pattern over and over and over and over again from the last 15 years of community organizing I've been doing, and we're really starting to get real around like how can we stop this cycle? You know what I'm saying? Like the other side doesn't even have to do anything. Our trauma systems is like is already, you know, activating our own sense of learned helplessness, you know? And so how can we move beyond that with each other? How can we depend on each other to really imagine what it looks like to move through those moments of tension and difficulty, recognizing that we're going to have these really intense trauma reactions, but be there with each other, with love, with a lot of boundaries, with accountability, with understanding, with compassion. And then what does that look like in real life? Because it's one thing to like think about it in this like really abstract way, but when you're in it and your brain is just making all these interpretations of the situation, the reality gets real skewed because, you know, your emotions is like overwhelming, and you know all the alarms are going off. It's really hard to then apply it in real life moment. And so I think in TJ Sundays we're like, okay, well, let's talk about things that have happened, things that are scary to talk about, things that are shameful, things that have been hard, and let's really get into the root of like how do we respond in these situations and get really technical. How do we start building relationship with one another so that when things do get hard, at least there is that relationship of trust? And how are we talking about things in a very tangible way, so that we have a plan, so we know what we're doing, and from there it can be modeling, I think, for ourselves and our other loved ones and other folks on what it might look like to kind of release ourselves from not release ourselves, but like to really move to navigate through hardship and difficulty and trauma in a different way, which in itself I think can be hugely healing, you know.
Hey, hi. I was hoping that it might be okay to maybe transition over to Q&A fairly soon, because actually we have a lot of good questions here, so that might lead the way. Do you want me to kick off with one of them? I mean, we've been sort of moderating a collection of questions.
Sure, if you could triage them and pick a couple.
Yeah, sure. So the problem is that, I mean, like, they're really good questions on a really broad base of trying to understand, you know, what mental illness is and what's being done about it in, you know, in our communities. I'm going to start with one. I mean, it's kind of mine. but I was really curious. And so just, I'm sorry, you guys are gonna have to break this down a little bit, but I guess number one, what is the message that the general population should know about regarding mental health? For instance, and here's the substance of this particular question is, what are the connections between mental health and say prison and jail populations, as well as mental health and undocumented populations? What are key things we should understand about ways that mental health is criminalized? And this is actually was sort of directed at Hugh, pertaining to earlier. I guess, how do we understand acuity levels in relation to morbidity? And, I know that since you work with OC systems, you have to sort of break this down and try to structure it in a public health way. Is there anything you might be able to sort of, maybe explain a little bit, or maybe also, in discussing challenges and successes in your own work?
Yeah, Gonji and Mimi, please also feel free to add. I think the mental health system overall, I think right now it's really structured in a way that is kind of sees people in whether they're like mild to moderate and severe. That's how sort of our funding system works right now, where if you're mild to moderate, then you typically go to your own private practitioner from your own insurance, right? Or if you have public insurance like Medicaid or Medi-Cal here in California, then you access it in that sort of realm. And then if you're severe, chronic, and persistently have a mental illness that is chronic and persistent, then you go to the county sort of system, right? And then if you, a point where you are a danger to self, danger to other, then you end up in a psych hospital, right? And typically the county is the one that's responsible for that care for folks who are severe and chronic. And then and oftentimes when you're discharged from the hospital, right, you either go back to the county or they send you back into the community, and you have to figure out and navigate that system. I know, as I was working on transforming the mental health system, one of the things we realized was that in Orange County, there's 18 phone numbers that you can call for mental health. And wow, 18 numbers, good. But then where the hell do I go? Like, where do I call? Right? There's like the worm line, there's the hotline. So when you're in a potential emotional distress and crisis, you need support, you have to kind of figure out whether you're hot, cold, warm, whatever else in between, right? And so even in that sort of way, our system is so chaotic. And so even when people get to the point where they've realized that they need some sort of help, right? And that takes a lot of courage to get to that point. It's impossible to navigate the system. And so that's where I say the system is failing people now, right? What I would say is that I do think that I just remember having a conversation with I was in the car with my two nieces who was 12 and 11, and NPR was on. That's the only station I listened to, NPR. And they were talking about suicide. And as a practitioner, I'm very comfortable talking about it. But as an uncle, I wasn't sure, right? I'm like, okay, do I turn it off? Do I leave it on? And then once it's over, do I have a conversation, right? And luckily I did, and had that conversation with my nieces, and find out that they have had thoughts of suicide, right? And what that means for them. And so I think in just wanting to add that to respond to Mimi, so what's bringing me some hope is that the conversation seems a little bit more open now around mental health, mental illness, because I think they're seeing a lot more young people. I don't have TikTok, but they see a lot of TikTok videos that talk openly about mental health and whatnot. And so it seems like there's more openness to have those conversations, but yet the system hasn't caught up to that. You know, we want people to talk about mental health, but yet, you know, we give people access to mental health, but what kind of access, right? Is it culturally relevant, right? And does it cover folks who don't have insurance? It doesn't right now, right? And we're in California. And so it is also incumbent upon, I think, practitioners to you know, and Gonji, your statement around like therapy is a right that everybody deserve. I think that's really important. So for therapists to take on the role, so, you know, having therapy as a social justice piece as well. And I think the what we're seeing nationally as a result, I think, of what happened in the summer of 2020, seeing George Floyd being murdered, there is a national conversation around how do we take law enforcement out or minimize their role in community mental health, right? And so I am seeing in Los Angeles, in Orange County, incremental changes in terms of making sure that there is a community mental health component where if a 911 calls turn out to be more mental health related, then a mental health team will come out rather than just the police and law enforcement. So I'm seeing a little bit incremental changes around that. I know in Orange County, Huntington Beach, of all places, Huntington Beach has that kind of community mental health model. And then just recently Garden Grove and I believe Newport Beach. So it's being adopted at a city level rather than a county level right now. Gonji, Mimi, anything?
Yeah, I want to echo both of your comments in terms of like Gen Z is fucking amazing because they are willing to talk about mental health and have already developed so much language for their own mental health, for thinking about it in general, right? As a generation, I'm seeing that too. And that gives me so much hope. And I love and feel really frustrated by Hieu's comment that like the system is not caught up to where this generation is in terms of what they're demanding for their mental health. And I think the criminalization of mental illness, mental health issues via the police system is like you're saying, a continuing damaging model for folks, right? So like on university campuses, professors are co-opted into this process too, right? We're supposed to report if we're concerned about a student, if we have concerns, and that reporting system goes basically directly to police because nobody wants to be liable, right, for somebody who's having a mental health crisis. And so we pass on the responsibility to the police, who are not at all trained to deal with mental health issues. Police are trained to manage disruption, right? Not to help somebody in a crisis. And so if police arrive, they will approach somebody as a disruption that needs to be managed. And if you are experiencing mental health crisis, if you're disabled, you are more likely to be killed by the police than helped by them in those kinds of experiences, right? Or if you're not killed by them, you start getting funneled into the system that Hieu is talking about, right? Where you get involuntarily hospitalized, and then the care from there kind of just, I don't even know what the care there looks like in terms of if it can actually do anything for you besides re-traumatizing you, if that's how you enter the system, right? So I think that I'm both hopeful and then feeling like, what the fuck at the same time.
So yeah, that's a really good point, Mimi. I mean, I think that the continuum of services that are necessary is so complicated and involves so many intersection points. It's almost really difficult to talk about. I think that, so there, I think that this question actually does somehow, we can lead into this next question, even though it seems disparate, but I think this is really important. It's a great question too. So what are some of the affinities and tensions or divergence when it comes to clinical practices and BIPOC queer activisms? Are there tensions or constraints related to the professionalization of mental health care you would like to discuss? And I do think that somewhere in both questions, we're talking about particularly vulnerable communities, and I mean, the way that really, systemic oppression is embedded into that as well.
I think Gonji spoke this a little bit already, right? In terms of like queer communities, especially queer communities of color, BIPOC queer communities, have had to figure out how to take care of themselves and each other because they're structurally abandoned in so many ways, right? And then even from the level of like institutions all the way down to like their own families. And so I look to queer community often for guidance and for inspiration on models of care that are community-based, right? And that don't rely on large institutions to do it, because they already recognize institutions fail us. I feel like other folks who are not queer don't always realize that as early on as queer folks do. And so I think models of kinship, right, queer kin, queer fam, chosen fam, already form a backbone of care that I find needs to be everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that this is very connected, I think, to even the previous question too, around the professionalization of mental health care. And like, yeah, I think it's tough because I think historically, APITA folks as well as QT/BIPOC people have historically been re-traumatized by what we consider mental health in the United States. Thinking about where it started in the 70s as this de facto, like at these mental health institutions as these de facto prison systems, and the way that being a person of color, being queer, trans has been pathologized by this field, like it hasn't been a safe place. And so, I think that we still have a long way to go, because the more that mental health becomes medicalized and the more that we continue to pathologize certain things, it continues to follow along this vein of gaslighting that we've been talking about our communities. And I think that there's a lot of QTI/BIPOC mental health folks who are getting to conversation around like what needs to look different, because this notion of this like Freudian, cis-centric, heteronormative, white, neutral therapist, it's not neutral. It means cis, hetero, white man, you know what I'm saying? And that's not what our people are looking for when they're looking for therapy. Like, I know as a Korean person, I know that like older Korean folks are looking for other Korean people who will understand their experiences. They're therapizing each other. They're going to the church. I know QT/BIPOC people are looking for other QT/BIPOC people who are going to mirror our experiences. We don't want someone who's neutral, because neutral means fear. It means re-traumatization. And so, yeah, and I think we also really need to look to the disability justice movement to, again, really dismantle this notion of what pathology is, and how we approach illness versus wellness, and how that gets recreated in the mental health field. And that's often kind of modeled by these county systems where everything's, like becoming very medicalized. But yeah, I think there's a lot of folks who are really tapping into our imaginations and getting really creative on, okay, what do these other different systems of care, what does what does that look like? Which is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add that I think over the last maybe 10, 15 years or so, the mental health system has really look at the community lens, right? Or people with lived experience. That's what they call it, right? People who have gone through and currently or have experienced mental health challenges. to be in the workforce, right, as community mental health workers, as peers. And I think that yet, you know, the system talks a lot about, you know, valuing them as experts, and because they have lived experience with mental health, mental illnesses. And yet just California is the last state to pass a law recently, I think last year, that says that would allow peer mentors, people with lived experience, to bill for their work, right? To bill insurance for their work. And so the system is trying to catch up, right? And there are this very small movement, but I do think that there is a realization of the significance of people who have lived experience and what their role is in the mental health system and transforming the mental health system, right? So just wanted to acknowledge that piece, and not, you know, not, yeah, there's still a whole bunch of things that we need to do and deconstruct, but there's that small kind of recognition there.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like these are small moments of hope as we're seeing change happening in all different kinds of spaces. And I appreciate both of you pointing to all the different kinds of spaces and all different kinds of changes that are happening. This conversation was amazing. Thank you so much. We are running out of time. I feel like we could talk for like another hour, probably easily, about mental health. I can talk endlessly about it, and I would love to learn more from both of you. But I will now wrap us up and transition to the GYOPO folks if they want to say any last words. But I want to thank you both so much for this really smart and life-giving conversation. So Eric, I don't know if you want to say any closing words, or anybody else at GYOPO.
I mean, I'm mainly going to echo what Mimi said. I mean, it's a really great panel. Thank you so much, all of the participants. And I think, you know, my feeling leaving this is that there is hope and there is some level of change, and, you know, especially around the kind of intellectual framework around this. But yeah, there's a lot to do, and you know, I really commend you all for you know, putting your lives and work into this. So thanks so much for participating and being here. And I think we can close.
Thank you.